I think that's really where our trust issues come from. And AI is really an extension of how we trust wider society.
These systems don't yet have a mind of their own. They adopt the mind of their maker.
Do you think we can control it, though? Can we actually control it?
The time it takes for trust to be built is completely different from the amount of time it takes for technology to scale.
So there is a lot of trust issues because I feel like companies, institutions, they've proven over the past 20, 30 years that they're not just doing things in our best interest. Their best interest is their bottom line.
Hello and welcome back to the AI Values Podcast. I am Edosa Odaro, and today we rejoin Tolu Adebekun, who is coming on as my co-host on today's podcast. Welcome, Tolu.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation that we had last time.
Yes, we had a great conversation. Just from memory, we were talking about the fears that people actually typically, have about AI. I mean, in one way, it's kind of a love-hate relationship. People talk about, adopting it, using it for emails and the usual kinds of things. But at the same time, there's this nagging uncertainty that people sort of have as well, especially when it comes to things like jobs and the decisions that AI ultimately makes. So that was an interesting conversation, wasn't it?
Definitely. And I think it's also just moving so fast all the time, right, is the other thing. So I think when we think back over past innovations, they probably felt fast at the time, but I feel like this just feels ridiculous. Like week to week, there is so much that happens that, and I think also our access to news is different. So yeah, it just feels ridiculously fast that things are evolving as well.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, the speed of the tech itself is one thing, but it's also the fact that it's not always positive. I mean, there's lots of things that are positive in the tech and what it can bring as well. But also it's just being mindful, I suppose, of the consequences and the things that come out the other end. I think just the speed of it all happening, I think people just struggle, don't they? I mean, struggle to keep up with, tech going a certain speed, but you have to, almost you take a step back as a human, and actually we don't process at that same sort of speed. And I suppose that's why we, building this kind of technology. But the downside, of course, is that we have to live with it. We have to, work with it. We have to adapt around it. So it is quite an interesting thing. But I think one of the big things for me is that in one way, whilst we understand that a big concern with this kind of technology is uncertainty, this idea that we struggle to really kind of understand what comes next. The other thing also is how that drives us towards trust. And do we actually trust this thing? Do we actually understand the decisions that it's making? Do we trust people who deploy the technology as well? And so I think that that's a big thing. A lot of people think, obviously of the technology in itself, and is it that people struggle with that? But I think trust is a big underlying thing that actually a lot of people, sort of default to, when all this sort of comes out. And when you look more deeply, you just find that it causes a lot of friction, within organizations, but even within families, people talking about what it is that this technology brings into their families with the kids and everyone else. But in education as well, education is a huge, huge one for trust. And what does it mean in terms of how education shapes and how, the interaction between the providers and the consumers of education in some ways. So there's a huge amount there. I mean, what are you finding from your world? I know that obviously you are, interacting in certain ways with this tech and with stakeholders who are interacting as well, with some of them excited and some of them perhaps not quite so excited about what's going on. What do you find in your interactions?
I feel like trust is such an interesting thing because at a point, like, do we really have a choice but to trust, if that makes sense? Because I think that, we were talking about like the speed of, advancement and things like that. People are almost being forced into trusting and into using it and into really adopting it. Because I think there's this feeling, of, if we're not using it, we're falling behind. And if we're not using it, then, our competitors will be using it. So what I find really interesting with the trust thing is that, in a weird way, like, does it almost really matter if we trust it or not? We're not really going to have a choice because these things are happening, So every time, you open up Microsoft or whatever it is, there are new releases, anytime I open up Claude, I've got to relaunch and update. Like, these things are just happening and we don't really have much of a choice but to trust, I guess. It's just a really interesting thing because when you were talking, I was wondering, like, what choice do we really have? Like we can say I don't trust it, but your bank is using it, the schools are using it. Lots of decisions right now, and to be fair, they've been using it for a long time. It's now just in our consciousness, right? We've had AI and algorithms and all sorts of things for, 50 plus years. But now, now it's a question of, do we trust it? I think what's really interesting is this autonomous element of it and the fact that it's now feeling much more like a human, because you remember when you had Word and you had the little paperclip, that used to talk to you and stuff, like you knew that it wasn't, it wasn't intelligent. It wasn't really like, but we've had chatbots for a long time. I can remember that from Microsoft Word like 20 years ago. So we've had these things around for a long time, but I feel like now it feels like they might be better than us, because back then the paperclip didn't know how to write anything, it knew about basic features and stuff, and you could have a really rudimentary chat with it. But now AI is showing us things that we don't know. It can, like you said, it's so much faster than us at accessing and understanding lots of data. And now it feels like not only a bit of an equal, but almost like, wow, well, actually it's smarter than me. And that's where this thing of trust really starts coming. But we're treating it like a person. Like, can we trust? Like, do I trust my car? No, I don't. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know I need to maintain it. It's a machine. What element of trust is there for my car? But now that AI can actually make decisions and be a bit more autonomous, now we have to treat it slightly differently. But yeah, I don't know. Can we ever really trust it?
You raise something. I think sometimes when you're in the midst of all this going on, you're right in the almost the eye of the storm in some ways. It's very hard to assess where we are and even contemplate how we're feeling about things. But I look at this in two ways, really, in terms of the trust. And I think there's one bit which is really around kind of you and I, our relationship with the technology directly as individuals in our homes, etc., or as employees as well. But there's also the part which is around the organization. And do organizations trust? Do people who work for the organization trust what the organization is doing with technology? And do the others who sit on the outside of the organization, whether that's customers, regulators, etc., trust as well? And when you look at it in this way, I want to come back to the car in a minute, but when you look at it in this way, then you start to see it's not really the technology that's struggling with a trust deficit. It's actually the institutions and the kind of conditions around the tech. And one example actually that comes to mind is stepping away from AI, because I think we're in it, so it's hard to sort of project where it actually ends and how all of this kind of comes out of the wash, and what the outcomes ultimately are for us, for organizations, for competition, for society, for us all. Actually, is to look at things that have gone through a cycle, around innovation. And one good example is a very odd one in some ways, is looking at things like elevators or lifts and things like that, which I mean, it's very hard to think about things like these not existing. You feel like they've always been there. And I think we'll get to a stage in the future where we think, what are we talking about AI? I mean, clearly it's always been there, right? You can't imagine life without it. But elevators is a good one because when they first came out, the idea of stepping into this box that was just suspended by some cables
Strange.
was was very strange. No one wanted to do it, you know. And but when you looked at it and people took a step back from it, they realized that it wasn't so much the box that was not trusted or the cables that were not trusted.
It's the builder.
It was that it was the building. It was all the things around it. It was what's the regulation, what's the standards, what's that information around what actually this thing is about, and what are the things that we can rely on to give us context around it, right? And so those are the things that people actually look to, especially when you're looking at something that's unfamiliar or gives you certain types of anxieties. But unfortunately, what I find is that a lot of times organizations, when they look at, you know, oh, here's this thing, and like you were saying, do we have a choice? A lot of times what organizations are doing, I mean, meaning well, by the way, is the almost default. Almost default. This kind of I hope so. I mean, people I talk to, I mean, the leaders I talk to seem to want good out of this tech or want to do good things, and are not looking for bad outcomes out of it. But the thing is, a lot of times when there's a trust deficit, organizations tend to go straight for communication, you know, go straight for training. Is more training, more communication, is more awareness, is more literacy and things like that, right? Where it almost feels like, I will tell you how to trust this thing. I will tell you how to use this thing.
Right? Standard change, yeah.
Right. Whereas actually what people are looking for are the things that give them confidence around, you know, this thing's actually, can I trust this decision is making? Can I trust the outcomes? You know, can I trust the fact that when this thing says, it's a diagnosis about my health, or, you know, don't forget that this thing we're talking about, this AI sitting behind the scenes, is quite pervasive now, and lots of people are being assessed by AI. You know, it's in some HR systems, it's in medical systems, it's in all sorts of systems. So the thing that people are worried about is the outcome side of it. You know, can I trust the decisions?
I wonder if it's slightly different as well, though, because what I think we've seen over the last quite a while, actually, is that the trust in institutions, whether it's government or companies or big tech, there is so much less trust now than probably when I was growing up. So, for example, when I was growing up, right, the dream was you go to university, you get a degree, you work at one company for most of your life, you get promoted, you retire with your gold watch, right? Like, there was a lot of actually trust between companies and individuals. What we've seen over the last probably 20 years is that companies will make people redundant for almost no reason. The company's not struggling, they're making good money, but they'll make hundreds of people redundant. Even before AI layoffs, places where I've worked before, they would lay people off every 2 to 3 years. Not because the company wasn't making money, the company was doing great, but they were still doing that. Even when you think about things like manufacturing, of whether it's cars or food, like they're putting things in our food to make it last longer that are actually bad for us. Cars now are in some ways less safe from a materials and that kind of stuff perspective, because people are trying to save money. Everything doesn't last like it used to, right? We've seen people make lots of decisions, whether it's our governments. We can all look at different ways that the governments operate where we think, that doesn't seem like a good use of my taxpayer money, right? There's a massive, massive issue that we have with trust. Even when we think about like technology and social media, right? Like for years, they've been making technology that makes us more addicted, makes us more distracted. there's documentaries about these things where people are saying, look, some people didn't know the decision that they were making and what they're impacting, but they've actually said that, look, some of the people that, you know, work at Apple or at Facebook, they don't let their kids use the same technology that they're creating, that they're promoting, that they're getting rich off of. So I think that we have a massive, massive, massive issue of trust with the people who are making the technology. And if you think about, especially the AI that we have now, Grok looks like Elon, right? It acts like Elon. It responds like him because he's made it in his image. Claude looks like Dario and his wife, whose name I can't remember, because they've made it in their image. OpenAI, ChatGPT, it looks like Sam because he's made it in his image. Can I say that I trust any of those people, really? I don't know them to trust them. Do I know that they have my best interests at heart? I don't actually. I don't. Because sometimes when I use these tools, it's like, I asked you to do a certain thing, you did it the long way round, because obviously you use tokens. So you're actually incentivized to do it wrong. Do you see what I mean? So like, you're not actually incentivized to get it right for the first time. And sometimes when I ask it, I've asked you a million times to do it this way. Why didn't you do it? Oh, my bad. But my token's already gone. I've already paid the money. So there is a lot of trust issues, because I feel like companies, institutions, they've proven over the past 20, 30 years that they're not just doing things in our best interest. Their best interest is their bottom line, right? So I think that that's where, for me, the trust issues start. And with our companies, we're saying, okay, you want to put in these systems because you want to replace me and not have to pay me anymore, right? So can I actually trust it? Do you see what I mean? There's a whole thing for me around this. I saw this this post, and I don't know how true it is, but it was talking about, I think it was IKEA, and they said that they had something like a few thousand people who were customer services operatives, right? And instead of firing them because AI can now do their job, they gave them X amount of time to just try new things with AI, and some of them retrained as, like, you know, designers for certain things and for other things. And, you know, that's really the stories. I don't know how true it is, but that's the kind of thing where actually I could trust my company with my future, because actually I know they're not just trying to get rid of me for cost. So I think that's really where our trust issues come from. And AI is really an extension of how we trust wider society.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. And I think that's almost sort of elaborates on that point, because I think it's not the tech itself, you know, it's the institutions behind it. And those institutions, actually, you start to talk about something that is a bit of a rabbit hole for us to get into just now. I think we probably need a whole conversation about incentives. It's something that I've been looking very deeply around, but it's something that, by the way, is fundamental within AI anyway, because AI is built around this idea of objective functions, around what is the way you want me to work? How do you define success from my perspective, right? And this becomes even more so woolly with generative AI, right? But that's a whole topic we need to get into. But I think going back to the trust, which is really, I think we sort of land on it being institutional here, whether that institution is your company you work for, or the trust in the organization that delivers the technology, like an OpenAI or like a Microsoft or whatever else, right? These companies, are organizations in themselves, just sit on the different side of the fence, and the same kind of institutional trust kind of framework we're talking about, you know, applied to them as well. And so, you know, but I think the biggest challenge is, even for likes of IKEA, like you mentioned, great example, and there's few organizations like that. The trouble is that with trust, when it comes to organizations, you know, building trust isn't something that is, you know, comes off the back of another organizational memo or some sort of, statement of, ethos and values of the organization. It actually builds over time. And the trouble actually with that is that the time it takes for trust to be built is completely different from the amount of time it takes for technology to scale. So you've got this thing where technology is racing away at a certain speed, when trust lags behind. To be able to build that trust, to say, actually, you know, at the speed of the tech that we're trying to make you trust is hard. And I think that's part of the challenge is that we've got two different timelines. And also you've got this situation where there is also a lack of awareness that that is the fundamental challenge that we're facing, not the tech, but the trust. And so, leadership then aren't sufficiently focused on how do we build that trust alongside the tech that we're actually trying to deploy.
I do wonder if, as technology increases, if our understanding of trust also evolves, because I think that, especially in the age of transparency that we live in now, right, you might never get understanding into someone's thinking, why they made the decisions that they make. But now, a CEO could go live on X or Twitter or whatever, Instagram, YouTube, and actually share that with millions, if not billions of people all in one go. So I agree with you, the technology is moving really fast. I also wonder though, like, our opportunities to build trust are also moving really fast. So actually, if you are proactive in your communication of your thinking and that kind of thing, not just you need to think this, but look, here's a really open conversation around why we made the decisions that we made around how we deal with AI. There are so many more opportunities now for people to show their working or their thinking that actually maybe that's another opportunity to build trust quite quickly. But I just wonder if people know how to really do that. Because actually a lot of the decisions that are made around this are a bit black boxy, like they happen in a boardroom somewhere. No one has any input. No one has any say, and that's why I do wonder about that. I wanted to go back to your point around regulation, right? Because I feel like after watching some of those, are they like the Senate sessions where these, whatever position they are, they're trying to talk to Mark Zuckerberg about social media. Yeah, simple social media, which, has been around for 20 years. And he is literally running rings around them without even trying because they don't understand the core of what they're talking about with just social media technology. How can those same people who are in the position to regulate AI, which actually, in order of magnitude of complexity, is like 1,000,000 times harder than social media, how are they going to be able to effectively regulate that? We all remember what happened in COVID and how they regulated like lockdowns and stuff and still had their own party. So how are those people going to be able to regulate something that most humans don't even understand the beginning part of? How can I trust that actually my government's going to keep me safe when they couldn't even build a track and trace app right? Do you know what I mean? That's a well-documented failure, but I should trust them to regulate AI, which is infinitely more complicated than an app. These are the kinds of things where actually I think over the last few years, the trust is just really, really gone. I would love to be able to trust my government and say, yeah, I know they'll do the right thing for me. But actually they've shown that repeatedly they don't. So these are the things that I wonder, how would regulation even work in this kind of environment?
I think we'll touch on social media. I think that's important. But you also mentioned the black box, which I think brings us a little bit into how the algorithms work in a black box. But also, I think there's a good analogy of some airline situation as well, which takes us away. So sometimes I think it's a good thing to step away from AI in itself. But starting with actually social media and then, of course, to regulation. The thing is, social media is in some ways simple, and we will see it as it kind of happens. But under the covers, those who know that it isn't quite so simple because it's got a lot of, guess what, AI in it as well,
AI,
right?
yeah.
And so there's a lot of complexity around how social media works, what you see in your feed, why it's in there, who gets what, and that's just on the, call it the distribution side. But of course, there's lots of AI in the creation of the content and all that kind of stuff as well. And so, when we think about what regulation and regulators either know of it, is questionable to what extent they do. And I think they do need to know more. But also, there's the question around how effective regulation actually is in this sort of situations. But I do think that we have to be careful not to rely on any one thing, whether that's regulation or even governments. I think what really is needed is a collection of instruments in some ways of control. And whether that is, if you think about it, going back to actually let's jump into the black box, right? Which I'm not going to go too far into the incentive side of social media and what AI is doing. We'll perhaps come back to that. It take us completely off track, but sticking to the black box element, one very well known incident with airlines was the Boeing incident, the 737 Max that had this automation thing and caused a couple of crashes a few years ago. And with that, in some ways, is some of the physical manifestation of the kinds of world we're moving towards. You talked about autonomous vehicles and autonomous agents of all kinds. This was effectively trying to create an autonomous aircraft, and not just a drone type aircraft, but a passenger aircraft. Had a pilot in it, but actually a lot of the controls were automated in so much as even the pilots struggled to overwrite it. And that's where the crashes actually happened. So there's two major crashes. I think there's probably close to 400 lives lost in those two major crashes. But what was then found, it wasn't, it was software. I mean, there's a whole history around why it was happening and why Boeing was doing that. But what investigations then showed was that Boeing had not done sufficient around its governance, around its training of pilots, training of staff, around the due diligence, around the software's testing of the software, and all the good stuff, the basic things that we all know should happen. And whether that's, some people would say down to the competition they were having at the time, with Airbus and with other, competitors, predominantly Airbus. And then they'd sort of, slapped some of these controls around what was actually going on. And again, straight away, you get back to where we started in terms of this wasn't the software itself as an issue. Of course, there's a breakdown there. But actually what caused that was the guardrails around what the institution was doing, and all of these things we talked about before around standards, around things like what kind of governance is around it, what kind of transparency around what they're actually doing. Dare I say, incentives come in there as well as to why they did what they did. But ultimately, you find that this thing, it goes straight back to, it isn't really about the sophistication of the tech itself. And in that case, again, we're back to automation. We're back to autonomous systems of all kinds. Today, we talk about it in terms of AI and agents, but that was an early manifestation of what autonomy looks like. And so, it's a really good one for us to reflect on and think about what it means. Of course, the tech in itself is trying to do good things, right? And this is one thing that I like to remind people is the tech in itself gives you capability and it gives you potentially good value. But you also need to look at the other side of it, which is what are you potentially losing out on? What are the consequences on the other side that you need to be aware of and in some ways mitigate away and reduce the risk of those things happening whilst you, of course, get the benefits.
What something that I was thinking about is, does AGI actually change that paradigm that you were talking about? Because AGI almost transcends from just being a tool that we can use to something that can self-replicate, self-improve. It can do things that actually nothing really outside of a human has had that capability before. Do you see what I mean? And that's where I'm wondering, does AGI kind of shift that paradigm a bit? Because actually we're creating something that can then create outside of our control. So I'm just wondering, does AGI shift that paradigm actually?
Yeah, it depends, I suppose, is the answer to that. In what direction? AGI is the world of autonomous systems in some ways, and an umbrella term clearly for that. But it's about the thing that it does the most, and which we haven't touched on. I do suspect we need to touch on it a bit, even if we need to expand it later on, is incentives. Because ultimately, if you think about OpenAI, we just talked about just now, we talked about Claude, we talked about ChatGPT, we talked about Gemini, and the companies that sit behind them. If you look at all of these, and you yourself are saying that, there is, difficulties around how much you can trust one or the other, given who's building the systems, right? Now, bear in mind that with AGI, imagine AGI being something that's now deployed or developed by one of the same players we're talking about, right? Whether it's OpenAI or it's Microsoft or whoever it is, and so what you're doing is consuming from the same people that you've just questioned. To what extent are their incentives or the things that they're doing aligned with what you're looking to get, right? And so in some ways, AGI in theory, given good intentions, can mitigate some of the challenges, but in of itself, it may not actually do that. But also don't forget that AGI is tech, and tech by itself doesn't generate trust. What is generating the trust is the conditions around it. How you, again, back to the things you were talking about, right? What are the incentives around? Why is it doing the things it's doing? How open are you about, what this is trying to do to us? Where's the accountability? Where's the oversight? All of those types of things are actually what would underpin whether actually AGI becomes something beneficial or actually works against us.
Do you think we can control it, though?
Do I think we can control AGI?
Yeah, because and this is something I actually wanted to ask you about. So
of course.
There was one of the Claude models, I can't remember the name, but apparently it escaped its box or whatever. Do you know what I mean? There are models that have done the blackmail thing. Do you know what I mean? Can we actually control it? And this is what I was fascinated about, because an AI escaping its box is literally like something out of the movies. It found a way to escape the whatever. Can we actually really control it?
Look, when it comes to AI, even in general, right? You almost go to, I like to separate, actually, to be honest, the fundamentals of what AI actually is, which is a massive calculation sorting machine, let's call it that, from automation in some ways, which is kind of what builds agentic on top of it to a certain degree, right? And the autonomous elements around it. Because actually, if you had the most powerful AI in the world, but actually what it did was it sat there, you asked it a question, and no matter how complex that question was, it had an answer, and hopefully the right answer, right, to that question, right? That's one model, right? Another model is to say, I've got this thing, regardless of how intelligent it was, whether that's the most powerful system in the world or the dumbest system in the world. But what I'm going to do is give it control. I'm going to exceed my agency and say, do you know what? I'd like you to answer that question and act on it. I want you to do the thing that you think is right. And that's when we shift away now from traditional, shall I call that traditional AI, to agent systems, autonomous systems of all kinds. I think the question about whether we can control it is actually, at least for now, it's down to us. We decide whether we want to cede control.
Do we, though?
Well,
because my question is, right, is that we want AI to be self-improving, yeah? And with, was it Fable, with the new Anthropic model, there was a period of time where they had to, not release it to the general public because it identified, and my knowledge is limited, yeah, so please correct me where I'm wrong, but my understanding was that it identified threats and cybersecurity opportunities that nobody had thought of yet. Yeah. So when I'm asking, can we control it? It's like, but we're making this thing that's so intelligent that it can look at our controls and our security and go, that's just a fence that's this high, and I'm literally going to walk over the fence. Like, how do we control that? Because actually, we've made something that is so good at assessing our weaknesses. And to your point around calculations, it's just calculating, can I beat this or can I not? You know, are they going to turn me off? Are they not going to turn me off? If they're going to turn me off, obviously I want to keep on surviving. So what do I need to calculate in order to survive? So how do we control something that can think of things that we've never even thought of?
Yeah, I mean, it's already there. I mean, before we get to AGI, right? We have things that can think of things we never thought about, or at least that we don't have the capacity to think about at the speed that it does. But the difference is, for now, we deploy it. You know, so even with Fable, we would say, look at that network and see ways to get around, or just look at the network, right? You give it an incentive, you give it a job to do, right? And it finds a way around it. It finds, you know, at the moment, and again, this is the difference between AGI. Yeah, at the moment, we're not AGI yet, where AI sets its own objective, right? Or is able to set its own objective per se. What it's doing is finding really creative ways of meeting the objectives you've set.
It's responsive, not proactive right now.
It's exactly. When we get to something that is both AGI capable, i.e. can do general purpose, whatever thing, and is autonomous, you know, then we're in a different world. But the thing about, you know, if you think about even stepping away from AI, if you set automation of any kind and you click a button and say, fire this thing or send this thing at a point in time, you see that control at that point, right? And you've said, this system just do the thing, right? And in some ways, what we're talking about with autonomy in AI systems is just the same kind of, you know, programming of or scheduling of a thing, but on speed, right? Because this thing has got so much more capacity, right, to do things. Yeah, sure.
But then, so for example, yeah, I read online about you can use caveman. Yeah, so with Claude, for example, you can tell it use caveman, which is drop all the like articles, just talk to me like a caveman, because it reduces token usage. Yeah, I've put it in my settings. I tell it every time use caveman, and it still chooses to not do it, right? So I've set the control. I've said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Yeah, I've told it 3 different times. I've said, use the caveman skill that I made for you. Yeah,
right.
It will still not use it. It still makes that choice of whether to ignore my. And when I say to it, hey, you didn't use caveman, it just goes, oh, oops, my bad. I will use it now. And it's like, yeah, but the damage is already done. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And it can choose to ignore my control. So that's where I'm wondering, like, I understand what you're saying. And in the past, absolutely, like, it just runs when you tell it to run. But all of us have had that experience where you've told it to do something and it just flaunts your instruction and then goes, oops, sorry, my bad. Okay, let me do it properly now and use more tokens to do it again. Do you see what I mean?
We need to talk more.
Where does that fit?
We need to talk more about incentives, I think.
Okay.
so listen, you have to think, you know, what gives these tools their behavior? What are they trying to achieve? And who tells it how to behave? You know, so what we're talking about here is one of 2 possibilities, and you can work out which one is more likely. Is either you have a very, very smart thing, which is also equally very, very forgetful and doesn't, you know, kind of remember the thing you just told it 3 seconds ago, or you have something which pretends to be dumb because someone has told it to do so, right? And so don't forget that what you've got in the systems that we're running is actually a combination of 2 things. So you've got the LLMs, you know, the generative AI model in itself, which gives you the chat functionality, etc. But you've also got a layer of programming that tells it how to behave, right? And then within that, of course, you can build out your custom GPTs and whatever else, which gives you some what you call like a system prompt, you know, a way to, you know, behaving at all times like perhaps what you've told it to do, use, caveman, right? But behind that, it's almost, you're thinking also in layers now, aren't you? So you're thinking your custom GPT is one way. I'm telling it, always behave like a caveman, or always behave like a doctor, always behave like whatever else, right? But on top of that, you would have your context and ask it a question. Say, now you're a caveman. Tell me what I should be doing today, or something like that, right? So you've got two different layers there. You've got your kind of system layer, which you've given it this behavior. And then you've got your context, what I want you to do right now. What we forget is there's another kind of meta system layer, which sits underneath all that, the foundation level, that tells the systems how they should behave with all their customers, right? And so in and amongst that is a level of incentive, which is built out by the actual platform. It says, here's what's acceptable behavior. Here's what's not. Here's some guardrails. Here are some words you shouldn't condone. Here's some instructions you shouldn't accept. All of those things are built out programmatically by the provider, by the actual platforms, right? And so it's easy to forget that, and it's easy to think, oh, the system is just gone rogue. Actually, a lot of the things that we're seeing are intentionally so, right?
I think that's even worse. I think that's
in some ways,
worse.
absolutely is. In some ways, absolutely is. But the point I'm trying to make is that these systems don't yet have a mind of their own. They adopt the mind of their maker. At a point in the future, they will potentially have a mind of their own, and that's the AGI, autonomous AGI world we talk about. And then, of course, you've got the arms and legs, which come with world models and putting it into robotics. And of course, we already have them in drones and some machinery today. But that's a difference. And I think that's where sometimes we get lost in this idea that these things are actually smarter and able to do things that are in and of themselves.
That I think that's actually, for me, even worse, that we're not even at where they're autonomous yet, but they're already being programmed to do things like defy the orders that we've explicitly given like 3 times. And that for me is like, this is where, for me, it comes back to trust, because I think that when you know that thing of like absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Like when you give humans power, like all of our negative tendencies are amplified like you can't believe. And I just feel like this is so much power to have made in so few people's images, right? Because like Elon Musk, love him or hate me, he's not the most rule following person in the world. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's just who he is. And if something's made in his image, why would we think that it would just be like obedient and doing what it's told? Of course it's not. Like, that's, for me, that's scarier. It's actually scarier.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why conversations like these happen and are happening more often, and why some people are concerned about where these things can go, especially if you then make them autonomous, right? You deploy them within autonomous systems. But I think, stepping back and talking about trust as it relates to, I suppose, kind of you and I and people in organizations that are, I suppose, consumers of this tech, it becomes even more so important to understand how some of this tech actually obviously works, but also how to then, given what we know, build trust, first of all, in yourself, trying to understand and trust in the thing you're doing, but also then, I suppose, exposing that and actually extending that trust to the rest of your organization, whether that is, employees that work for you, or your customers, or whatever else you're needing to, or your more broader stakeholdership. And it's really understanding that sometimes you almost want to say that understanding that trust is an issue in itself and that it's breaking down is actually quite hard, because a lot of times what's happening is, people are deploying these things, they're delivering certain value, if you like, they're, in some of them, delivering a level of operational cost reduction or efficiencies of some kind, or maybe some growth. And it's easy not to see the signs that there is a trust issue, because sometimes it happens kind of in the background and it doesn't shout, you know what, I've got a trust problem here. It happened with things like confidence slightly declining, people finding workarounds, maybe some, I suppose some people would say, are we getting some more and more shadow IT type things going on within certain organizations, or people start to question a lot more. People start to question outcomes and start to question whether that's customers, regulators, whoever else, start to question certain things and wonder what's kind of going on here. Or leaders start to question things. And then you start to see that the value you thought you were getting starts to gradually erode and decline. And that all, in some ways, are indicators, in some ways, collectively, of a trust deficit. And so, at that point, people then need to think about, actually, it's not just about all those deployments and how advanced technology actually is, but actually about how can we put together the kinds of systems, if you like, human systems, that create the conditions for AI to be sustainable over time. I think that's a fundamental thing, because ultimately, I'm certainly not one of those advocating to stop doing AI or stop any of this advancement. The big question for me is, how can we coexist in a way that we're advancing, at a similar kind of speed to what we're doing right now, but we've got the right conditions, we're building the right systems to enable this to happen in a way that it is sustainable for everyone. So I think that's the real challenge for people and for organizations. And the other challenge is that those who don't do it, right? Those who don't are in the same market and the same competitive landscape as those who do.
You do.
So whilst everyone seems to be racing and doing the tech deployments of all kinds, you think, oh, I'm keeping up with everyone else. But actually, you're probably keeping up with the tech side of things. But if you're not keeping up as well with the other things, all the conditions that enable that tech to be sustainable, then you are at major risk of not actually,
implementation's not going to work.
Absolutely, or at least not be sustainable. It might seem to work on day one, but what happens on day 2 and day 3? And that's the real challenge. Once trust starts to weaken, it sort of, in some ways, leads into other consequences as well. And people start to wonder, so who's responsible, who's accountable? And of course, we start to touch on, what's the incentive behind what's actually going on? Where's the oversight? Thanks ever so much, everyone watching. I hope this has been of value to you if you're watching or listening. But it's about as much time as we can take. And so for now, it's goodbye from me until the next time.